We are
All
live.
right, we are live. Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to today's webinar. Our webinar is with CNL's cleanup function team. But before we get started, I just want to say CRL is located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. As an organization, CNL recognizes and appreciates their connection to this place. CNL also recognizes the contributions that First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made, both in shaping and strengthening this community in particular, and this province and country as a whole. Now, if you heard a couple pings in the background there, I will turn off my notifications. I just forgot to do it before we started. Today's webinar is to introduce you to the overview, decommissioning, and cleanup plan for Chalk River Laboratories. We'll start with the presentation for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So here's a few housekeeping items. First, there is simultaneous interpretation. You can access the session in French and English through the globe icon on the bottom right of the bar, on the bar on Zoom. Select the language you would like to hear. We do have an hour planned. Like I said, we'll do 30 minutes of presentation and 30 minutes of questions if it takes that long. But we do encourage lots of questions. The Q&A icon, you have to submit you have to type in your question. There's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask them at any point in the presentation, and then we'll get to them at the end. Note that we are recording this session to post on YouTube afterwards. It takes a couple days. We have to download the recording and get it uploaded. If you're having any issues, please email ermstakeholder@cnl.ca, and a member of our team will try and get you sorted out. A little bit of a switch around today with some team members being sick, but we do have a great speaker for you today. Luc Robitaille is the environmental remediation specialist for CNL's cleanup function, and he is our host today. So Luc, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and good morning, everybody. I believe that we will be starting with Rachel, but I can introduce myself in the meantime. My name is Luc Robitaille. As Mike mentioned, I'm an environmental remediation specialist. I have over 25 years experience in groundwater remediation at different types of facilities in Canada, the US, and West Africa. And I have, I'm one of the main author of the overview, decommissioning, and cleanup plan, along with Renee Silke and Scott Clement, who are both on the call and able to answer questions if we get some at the end. I don't see questions, so I think what we're going to do is that I'm going to go through the presentation and then hold your questions to the end, and then we'll have plenty of time to answer questions. The presentation is not really half an hour long. All right, so Rachel.
Thanks, Luc. Good morning. So my name is Rachel Chenette. I'm a communications officer with the ERM Stakeholder Relations team. And so I've been supporting the overview, decommissioning, cleanup plan, communications and engagement, and the cleanup function engagement for the just over 2 years now, and that's about as long as I've been with CNL. So before we get started today, I did want to give the rest of the team an opportunity to introduce themselves to everybody who's participating virtually today, just to let everybody get to know who was working on the ODCP. So I know we have Renee on the webinar. Renee, do you want to give a quick introduction, and then we'll go to Scott and I'll continue on with the presentation today?
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. My name is Renee Silke. I've been with CNL for almost 19 years now, and I've been working on environmental protection and environmental remediation work for that time. Since about 2016, we've been working on initiating cleanup planning and the overview decommissioning cleanup plan, and I've been helping with that. And I have a background in environmental toxicology and risk assessment, so that's very productive in this in this case. And we are looking forward to sharing more about what we've been doing here with everyone today. And again, if there's any questions afterwards, please let us know, and I'll pass it along to Scott Clemo now.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name's Scott Clemo. I've been working on contaminated sites across Canada for the last 10 years, and I've been with CNL for, I guess, the last 5 years. I'm an environmental remediation specialist, and I am also have expertise in human health and environmental risk assessment.
Great, thanks, guys. So before we jump into the topic of the overview decommissioning and cleanup plan, or the ODCP, I wanted to do a little bit of a refresh. So we did have a September webinar on CNL's cleanup function. And so you can go back on our YouTube and watch it. I can post the link in the chat if anybody's interested. It is available in both official languages. But Samantha Scott, who's the acting manager of CNL's cleanup function, gave a presentation on the purpose of the cleanup function and our role at CNL, its underpinning regulations, an overview of the supporting programs, and how the cleanup function interacts with the waste management function. So it's a little bit more of a high level webinar. And then today we're going to go a little bit deeper into the actual document and one of the key documents for the cleanup function. So I'll pass it over to Luke now, who's going to walk you through today's presentation, and maybe I'll be back later for questions. Thanks, Luke. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and one thing that I forgot to mention that Scott and Renee mentioned is I've been with CNL for a little over 2 years. So what is the overview, decommissioning, and cleanup plan, which we'll refer to as the ODCP? Well, it describes the proposed approach for decommissioning and the remediation of the CNL site, the Chalk River Laboratories site. It supports the CRL's license condition 1.2, which states that CNL is required to document its proposed plan for decommissioning the site. This ODCP focuses on reducing environmental risks while allowing for site revitalization and continued operation as a world-class nuclear research site. The ODCP is a living document, and what we mean by that is that it's kept updated constantly. So as soon as there's changes that take place at the site, we make those changes also in the ODCP. But the actual document is updated every 5 years to be sent to the CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, for review. And the next time that we'll be sending it, as we'll see in the rest of the presentation, is in a few months at the end of January. Next slide, please. I don't know.
Rachel might have froze. Her computer freezes off and on sometimes.
Okay.
We'll try and get it sorted out. Sorry, Luke.
All right.
Just in answer to the question on the screen, will the overview decommissioning cleanup plan replace the comprehensive preliminary decommissioning plan? The answer is yes, and we will address that in the presentation coming up.
Thanks, Renee. Yeah, so a little bit of a hiccup here with online. It happens. So I will. Luke, is there any way you have the presentation and kind of maybe speak to it without showing until Rachel comes back?
I can. It'll take me a second to get there. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I can. Well, let's race. If I open it first, then we can.
Yes, I can try to go off of memory. So the requirement that is in the license condition is that we submit the CPDP every 5 years. The CPDP, the requirements of what we have to include in that document is found in the CNSC regulation, is Reg Doc document 2.11.2, which is around decommissioning. And there's also a CSA standard that covers the same elements. So that describes pretty much the basic elements that we have to include in the CPDP. What we realized is that we looked around the world at similar types of programs and similar types of reports that are produced, in particular at Hanford in Washington State, and then Fernald in Ohio. And we looked also at some facilities in Europe and tried to determine what is the type of information that they provide to their stakeholders. So what we did in developing the outline for the CPDP, the ODCP, is that we took all the requirements that we had in the regulations and we added these best practices from facilities around the world. In particular, we also looked at including information about how they ran their community advisory panels. Most of these facilities, oops.
No, you're good. You're good, Luke.
Okay,
it's
yeah, I just
Rachel's
got a
internet.
message
But
from Rachel.
we'll break here for a sec because I have the presentation up, so I will
Okay.
I will share it.
Okay.
Just have to go to presentation mode. Okay, people can see that, yeah?
Yeah, so next slide, please. So one thing that we did with the community advisory panel, we've been meeting quarterly for a little over a year so far, is that we looked at the cleanup vision and the cleanup mission for the site. Those were not included in the previous CPDP, so it's something we decided to add. So I know there's a lot of words here, but I think it's important. So I'm going to be reading what's on screen here. So the cleanup vision for the site is successful mitigation and remediation of impacts from historical operations at Chalk River Lab while protecting the health and safety and the environment during operations now and in the future. For the cleanup mission for the site, so as a world-class nuclear research facility, Chalk River Laboratories is committed to the long-term management of waste and the decommissioning of aging facilities and the environmental remediation of impacts associated with past operations. All present and future activities will be designed to support day-to-day operational safety and long-term environmental. I have all kinds of windows that show up on my screen and hide the text. I'll continue. Science-based solutions along with community stakeholder and indigenous engagement allows us to progress towards the desired end state of the site and the advancement of nuclear science and technology. And as I said, I'm sorry, some pop-up windows are hiding the rest of the text. We worked with our CAP members to refine these cleanup visions here, and their input on this and many other aspects of the proposed cleanup of the site has been very valuable. And I encourage you, if you're interested, to look at the end of the presentation. There's going to be some links to see how you could join the community advisory panel for the site, which right now is composed of about 8 to 10 people from the local communities. And we have a pretty diverse group of people right now that are helping us. So next slide, please. So as I started talking about a little earlier, the ODCP is an enhancement, if you will, of the comprehensive preliminary decommissioning plan. The first one was produced in 2015, the second one in 2018, and now since we're 5 years later, we're going to be submitting it in January of 2023. Next slide, please. So what are the cleanup objectives for the site? One is it's very important for us to consider the needs and the expectation of stakeholders, indigenous communities, and regulatory agencies. The idea for the site is to remediate affected lands to reduce risk to humans, animals, and plants. The previous CPDP focused mainly, both versions focused mainly on the decommissioning of buildings at the site, which have been progressing quite rapidly. We have over 112 buildings that have been taken down so far, but the ODCP, one of the areas that we focused on for this version here was really to look at the affected lands and how we can reduce risk, as is shown on the screen here. The idea is to try to allow unrestricted use of the CRL site where possible to safely meet proposed next land use. If you ever were to see to look at a map of the entire site, you'll see that just a small fraction of the property has in fact been developed. And the idea is to try to preserve the natural areas surrounding the actual operations as much as possible. So those areas, wherever there might be some cleanup required, we would try to bring those areas back to an unrestricted use moving forward. And the idea is also to coordinate the cleanup with existing activities at the site and with existing practices, so that we handle the waste only once. So one of the limitations we have is until the NSDF is in place, the material that we excavate would have no home, and we would have to store it until the NSDF or some other facility would be available. So in most cases, what we're choosing to do is spend our efforts to characterize these areas so that we're able to move on with the actual remediation once these disposal facilities become available. Next slide. So what are the key aspects that are covered by the ODCP? Of course, the environmental conditions, which include also the layout of the site, and all the utilities that are present at the site, all the different buildings, all the supporting services are included in what we would consider the basic environmental conditions for the site. We have included the recent discussions that we had with our CAP at the different meetings and the inputs that they provided us, so that we're able to demonstrate to the public that we're considering and taking into account the suggestions and the comments that we received from the CAP. We have also a new section on the integrated waste strategy. So the traditional dig and dump approach that is used in environmental remediation has a tendency to generate a lot of waste materials that have to be handled or disposed of. What we're trying to do with the decommissioning strategy is align more with the sustainability principles, where we're trying to look at the waste hierarchy. And the idea is that we're trying to reduce the amount of waste that is generated. And wherever possible, we're either trying to reuse the materials or recycle these materials, so that we have less materials to send for disposal and more material that can be beneficially reused or recycled. The ODCP now includes more information on quantities and types of waste that are present at the site, as we're progressing with characterization of most of the areas of environmental concern at the site. Another aspect that we're looking at with the ODCP is the proposed next land use. And we have some graphics here at the bottom of the page that illustrate the 4 types of potential future land uses that are being considered in evaluating the possibilities for remediating each of these areas. So as I've described already, the first one is unrestricted use. So those are natural areas, wetlands, wooded areas that are present throughout the site. We also have areas that have been disturbed in the past that we will be cleaning up and allowed to return to nature, and that's a parkland land use, which has some restrictions. For example, we consider the occupation of the land by humans to be less than 200 years in 200 hours within a year. But it's still returning the land to something that looks more natural. Previously, in the two previous CPDP, the assumption was that the entire site would be considered to be industrial land use. So we would clean up to allow for future industrial land uses. But right now we're trying to, as I said, try to leave nature untouched wherever it's possible. So the industrial areas are confined to the campus area, and also some potential redevelopment blocks that are located around the main plant road that extends from Chalk River all the way to the facility. And then we're going to have a few disposal areas of the site, which would include the NSDF once approved, and there's some historical landfills that are still present at the site, most of which have been closed and are no longer operational. And another enhancement that we have to the ODCP is that we have developed some risk-based site-specific screening and cleanup criteria. So when we're characterizing an area, we have to have some criteria that allows us to determine if the area needs remediation, and if so, to what level it needs to be remediated. For non-radiological compounds like metals or some organics, let's say petroleum hydrocarbon or solvents, normally we can look at some federal or some provincial criteria to establish, based on these same land uses, which areas need remediation. One of the issues we have is that there's very limited screening or cleanup criteria that exists for radiological compounds. So using the same approach that the federal government or the provincial governments have used to define their own cleanup criteria, we have used the same methodology, and we developed some criteria for the site itself. So that's being described in the ODCP. We have a detailed review of legacy issues, and I'll be talking about that in a second. So those are historical areas of operation where there might be some contamination that's left behind that will need to be addressed. And that the approach for site cleanup and redevelopment is taking a more strategic approach, considering the fact that the site in the previous CPDP, we were looking and modeling for the closure of the site to be within 100 years. But right now, with the renewed science and technology mission that the site has, the site is scheduled to be open indefinitely, supporting research in peaceful nuclear application in the medical fields and other areas as well, clean energy. So we're looking at remediating these different areas to allow for the redevelopment of the site for these future projects that are being considered. And of course, we're taking a hard look at hazard and risk assessment as part of the cleanup, and that's also included as part of the ODCP document. So next slide, please. So what are the main purposes for the ODCP? So what are we trying to achieve? So as I mentioned earlier, we have some regulatory requirements that we have to meet, which are presented in the CSA document or the CNSC reg doc. I also mentioned the fact that we looked at what was happening around the world, so that the type of reporting that we're doing and the type of engagement that we're doing also follows world best practices. And as you saw with the cleanup vision and cleanup mission and many other aspects of what we've been doing, is we're trying to integrate public and Indigenous engagement and feedback as much as possible. Next slide. So what are the changes between the ODCP and the previous CPDP documents? Well, one of the main one is, as I mentioned, we're taking a more strategic approach to cleaning up the site and decommissioning the site. So we're shifting from a building/facility focused cleanup approach and to look at the site wide and have a more holistic planning where we're looking at all these elements together. So what are the risks? What are the redevelopment potential? And trying to align our activities along the priorities for the site. We've identified over 60 areas of potential environmental concern at the site. Those include, for example, some snow dumps, some historical landfills. We have some firing ranges that have been used by the security forces at the site. We have several research and development facilities that are no longer in use that we have to make sure that we can clean up and close safely. So we're looking at characterizing these different areas. We've divided the site in 11 management units, which are broken down based on the local geology and also the type of activities that have taken place. And so looking at these different areas, we've enhanced the level of characterization. So we're systematically going through the site and collecting soil and groundwater samples. We have already at the site over 2,000 monitoring wells that are being used as part of compliance reporting and also as part of planning for remediation of these different areas. And then the report also includes a section on the roles of long-term monitoring programs and institutional controls at the site. So institutional controls can be physical things. So it can be, for example, an area where we would put some fencing, or we would put some erosion control or some drainage controls to make sure that the conditions are not deteriorating in the site. But it can also be some administrative requirements, like, for example, having some deed restrictions on or some land use restrictions in certain areas. So these are being put in place in areas where we're not going to be cleaning to bring the land back to unrestricted use for various types of reasons. And the ODCP also has some information on the progress in decommissioning, remediation, and site revitalization. As I said, the site now has a long-term mission, and we're trying to support that. And all these different aspects now are looked at as we're developing these remedial investigations and also the actual cleanup planning. Next slide. So what is the timeline for the ODCP? We started working with our local CAP to get to collect their feedback and also include that in the ODCP in September 2021. We're going to have our next meeting in a few weeks at the beginning of December. We completed the first draft of the ODCP last summer in July, and it went through several internal reviews and external reviews. It went to AECL, and now we're going to be, we started working with additional ongoing engagement activities with the purpose of having a document that we'll be submitting to the CNSC in January 2023. And once it's been accepted and commented on, within the next 5 years, we'll be producing the next version of the ODCP. Next slide. So as I mentioned, it's important for us to hear from you on the different aspects that we have in the cleanup and decommissioning of the Chalk River site. So if you're interested in applying for the Community Advisory Panel, we definitely welcome new members to join. So contact us. Rachel has more information if you want on how to join the group and signify your interest. This week, we will be continuing some public information sessions that were started a couple of weeks. We did 3 sessions on the Quebec side in the past few weeks. We have 3 that are still left, one in Laurentian Hills tonight, Deep River tomorrow, and then their session is going to be in Petawawa on Thursday. So we encourage you to go and talk to the different people from the site. We'll be covering the ODCP, but several other aspects of the Chalk River site cleanup and decommissioning. So I believe that's the last slide. So if you have any questions, I'm here with Renee and Scott and others to be able to answer your questions.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Luke. Great
and
presentation.
I apologize for the little hiccups that we had with the internet, that it happens once in a while.
Yeah, it happens. So there are lots of questions. So we'll get right into it. So this one is for Renee. Is there a copy of this presentation available?
Yes, we will post this webinar afterwards, and I believe that's how you get a copy of the presentation.
Yeah, Mike mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that this is being recorded. There'll be a few day delay for it to be downloaded on the website, and then it'll be available for you. You'll be able to watch the video of this session here.
Okay, next one. Do you know the major updates from the CNSC that will be coming in 2023?
I
was thinking we would need a bit more clarity on that question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the
Okay.
person's referring to.
Okay, we'll see if there's
I'm not aware of any at
more
this
to that.
moment.
Okay, the current comprehensive preliminary decommissioning plan contains estimates of volume and radioactivity of waste in the different waste management areas at CRL. Will the new ODCP also contain this information on volume and radioactivity of the radioactive waste at CRL?
We definitely have volumes that are estimated for some areas of the site. We're progressing with the characterization of the different areas. But one thing that is very important to be able to determine these volumes is to know to what level you're cleaning up these different areas. So as we're moving along, we have to look at these new cleanup criteria that we have developed for the unsaturated zone at this point. So the unsaturated zone is the area if you were to excavate in your backyard, for example, the dry soil that you go through before you get to the water table, before you hit water, that's called the unsaturated zone. So right now, since most of the wastes at the site are located in the unsaturated zone, we have developed these cleanup criteria for the site, and that's what would allow us to determine volumes that we have to remediate. But there are some areas where the impact is also found under the water table. So right now we're starting to work towards developing screening criteria for the saturated zone. And once we have that, it's going to be possible for us to refine our understanding of what volumes we're dealing with and what level of contamination may be present in these different areas that we looked at. Obviously, we have different types of contamination based on the different types of activities, and many of those 60 areas are almost clean, and they may be clean, especially the R&D facilities. So as I mentioned, we'll continue working on characterizing these areas, and that will help inform what type of volumes we have to deal with. It's clear that some estimates already exist because we needed to be able to determine capacity that we would need for potential disposal. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is a living document, so we keep refining these calculations based on this new information.
Okay, thanks, Luke.
I can just add a little bit to that, although that was quite a comprehensive answer. As far as the volume estimates for Chalk River go, we essentially should refer people to the Joint Convention report on the volumes. There'll be new input into that in 2023 and a new national report later in 2023. And in terms of total radioactivity, we keep that information in sort of the underpinning documentation. We have CNL's inventory records and inventory forecasts, and that level of detail is not usually included in summary level documentation like the integrated waste strategy or the Joint Convention report, or the overview decommissioning and cleanup plan. We also have the NSDF reference inventory that projects total radioactivity that will remain at the CRL site in the disposal configuration.
Okay, thanks, Renee.
No problem.
The next question is for Rachel. You mentioned the Community Advisory Panel several times. Will the CAP replace the Environmental Stewardship Council, which has been in place for approximately 15 years?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, good question. So the CAP in no way is replacing the Environmental Stewardship Council. Both have websites on cnl.ca if you'd like more information about either one. But there is a little bit of a difference. So the ESC memberships are representative of specific interest group, local organizations, Indigenous communities, and also includes local elected officials. Now, these folks have specific insight and experience to share with CNL. The CAP is related, but with a bit of a difference. It's volunteer members representing the general public, not a specific organization. And we wanted to hear from you, members of the community who hadn't had a lot of experience with connecting before. So that's probably the key difference. If anybody wants more information on the community advisor, and we'll be happy to chat with you about it.
Perfect. Thanks, Rachel. The next question is, could you expand on the 200-hour parkland criteria?
Hi, yeah, I could take that one.
Yep.
So when we are developing screening and cleanup criteria for the Chalk River site, there are assumptions that go into calculating what cleanup volumes or cleanup criteria need to be for specific land uses that we're considering. So we are looking at a parkland land use criteria as is in the question. When you're doing the risk assessment for that, you have to assume that a human would spend so many hours at the site per year. 200 hours is actually something that's recommended in a sort of a casual access parkland type recreational scenario that is in the government of Canada's federal documentation on detailed quantitative risk assessment. So that is where we've got the 200 hours per year number. It's sort of assuming that someone comes to the site to perhaps camp here or hunt here or ski here for so many hours a year, and that's how their exposure occurs to whatever's left after cleanup. So in the other scenarios that we've assessed, the amount of time that a person would be spending on the site varies substantially. It's substantially more. For example, if we're looking at cleaning up for industrial reuse, we're assuming that someone is here for 40 plus hours a week, that they might be digging in the soil as part of construction work. If we're looking at something like an agricultural scenario, which is not a use that we would really be considering at the Chalk River site, but it's more of a worst case assessment, then we would be assuming that someone lives here all the time, grows their food here, drinks well water here, etc. So that we can get the most conservative values possible for estimating what cleanup would need to go to provide something like an unrestricted use. So there's another question similar along this line later on. The question is, for the area of the site deemed unrestricted use or parkland use, is the intent that these areas are accessible to the community? AECL owns the Chalk River site, so that is not something that they are considering right now as opening up the site for community use, but we are considering in the longer term that there may be ultimately community use, and yes, under the unrestricted use or parkland use, those are the assumptions that we're making, that people would be coming to the site and using it, and making sure that the areas that we clean up to those levels would be safe for that in the long term. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and
Great, thanks, Renee.
Something that was very interesting for us is that we had a session with our CAP over these different land uses. So we showed them several areas that are part of the site, and then we explained to them what the land uses were and what the assumptions behind these land uses were, to get their feedback and see if they would consider these potential uses as being viable for the site. And almost unanimously, the CAP didn't think that the redeveloping the site for agricultural purposes would make sense. They thought that we should leave most of the site open to nature and returning it to nature wherever it had been used in the past and where it was possible. So that's why although the graphics seem to suggest an agricultural use, we're looking more at bringing the site back to an unrestricted use, which is almost the same assumptions.
Great, thanks, Luke and Renee. We'll keep going. Sometimes provincial and federal environmental requirements are not aligned. What ER criteria should be used at CNL properties, federal or provincial, or both?
When we are reporting these characterization for the different areas and the different work that we do at the site, we generally look at both. But since the site is a federal site, we look principally at the CCME criteria, but those don't exist for every possible compounds. So when there's compounds that are not covered under federal regulation, we look at the provincial criteria as well. But normally we report our results against both criteria.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. How does the ODCP address provisions in the GOCO contract? So that's government-owned contractor-operated contract for consolidation of all federal radioactive waste at CRL.
I do not know the answer to that. I don't know if Renee can help.
Yeah, well, I mean, at this point in this early stages of planning the overall decommissioning and cleanup of the Chalk River site, we do address this provision very generically, just in stating that we will make efforts to consolidate waste as appropriate as we're planning the cleanup of the site. So we don't plan on leaving little pockets of waste everywhere. We want to try and consolidate everything into a smaller number of waste management or disposal areas for the longer term. So we've addressed it in sort of a general fashion. We're not at the stage yet where we can commit to stating exactly what is going to be going where. The general assumption is a lot of the waste will ultimately be going into the proposed NSDF when it is available. That is a major assumption for planning cleanup right now. Otherwise, we'll be looking at the individual areas and planning how we consolidate them longer term.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Will CNL post the current comprehensive preliminary decommissioning plan so that the public can compare it to the new ODCP?
I don't believe that the CPDP is published right now. For the next version, the ODCP, the idea is that we'll produce a shorter version of the document for public consumption, but in either case, the CPDP and the ODCP can be requested directly from us, and then we can provide it to people that ask for it. It requires generally some level of protection of confidential information, but it's really around security for the site. So the type of information that is related to security has to be scrubbed from the document.
Okay, thank you. Are there any plans to develop preliminary remedial action plans or something similar to preliminary decommissioning plans to consolidate current information from the management units or areas of concern?
Right now, we have some reports that have been produced for each one of these 60 different areas, which allow us to identify the characterization gaps. And that's what we're dealing with right now. We're starting with the higher risk facilities. We're characterizing those. And these are the input that we will use to develop the remedial action plan for each one of these different areas. We're looking at them individually, but in a strategic approach. As I mentioned earlier, we're trying to allow for redevelopment where that's possible, or return to nature where that's possible. So that's how we're consolidating the information, because eventually the material that has to be disposed will have to go either to NSDF or some other similar facilities, or for waste materials that are not required to go to NSDF, then we have to send them to local landfills or other types of facilities as well.
Okay, thank you. Does radioactivity also affect disposal capacity?
Yes, the radioactive compounds obviously have to go to a facility that's allowed to accept this types of material. So for the Chalk River, as Renee mentioned, the assumption is that the materials, the low-level waste, would go to the NSDF if approved, and materials that do not meet the requirements because they would have too high of activity, for example, would be stored until there is a proper disposal facility for it.
Okay, thank you. Does the ODCP assume that intermediate level waste will be put in the NWMO repository?
I believe that the way that we have written it in the ODCP is that it will go wherever there's an approved disposal facility for either high level waste or intermediate level waste. I think that's the approach we're taking right now. I don't think we have identified a location other than the criteria is that it has to be a facility that accepts those materials.
Thank you. Does the volume of NSDF, which is 1 million cubic meters of low-level waste, is that enough to deal with all the potential low-level waste at Chalk River?
That's what we're trying to find out by characterizing these different areas. And as I mentioned earlier, we're using the integrated waste strategy to be able to reduce the volumes that would go to the NSDF. Material that can be sorted out, if we have a facility that allows us to do this. So we have several projects at the site right now that really look at maximizing the use of that volume of disposal area at the site. So the characterization will help us on that end, and having these new facilities to sort out and treat and etc. the different waste will help us extend the life of the NSDF.
All right, perfect. The last question, Renee, it says that you're typing the answer. Should I read it out, or are you going to type it to Ole?
I can just speak to it.
Okay.
We have a very high level discussion on cost in the overview decommissioning cleanup plan right now. It does not get into any of the detail. It essentially refers out to the documentation where these commitments are made.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, just looking at time, still got some time. Okay, does the ODCP have any built-in contingency if the NSDF is not approved?
At this moment, the ODCP does not have a plan B for low-level waste. It's something that we'll have to look at depending on what happens with the approval process. But right now, we're looking at moving the cleanup as fast as possible. So we're taking the approach that it would become available so that we can proceed with decommissioning these different facilities. So, you know, these 60 different little potentially contaminated areas at the site as Renee was mentioning, we're trying to clean up each one of these so that we don't have little pockets all over the site, and we're trying to consolidate them in one modern engineered facility, which will make control of these waste a lot easier to do.
All right, perfect. Okay, so with that, we will start to wind down. If any other questions do come in, please email ermstakeholder@cnl.ca, and we'll get an answer out to you.
And if you
so
want
before-
to join the CAP, make sure to contact Rachel or use the same email address to show your interest.
Yes, thank you, Luke. So yeah, please, there we do have an information page. Visit cnl.ca/CAP CAP, or email the ERM stakeholder relations team, which is ermstakeholder@cnl.ca. So once we get the links of the recordings, we'll send them out, and we'll also post them on YouTube. And feel free to distribute them anyway that might to anyone that might be interested. And we'll include responses to any questions we didn't get to. So with that, we will end this webinar. So thank you very much, Luke, Renee, and Rachel. And thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.